because he understood the nature of the wars that we were fighting. Please give a big round of applause for Joe Glenton.
Cheers for that. It's always good to come back here because this is where I came out, as it were, as an anti-war activist many years ago now. And so it kind of still has that feeling of home in some sense. But I'm going to start with an anecdote. On the day of the killing in Woolwich, by pure coincidence, I was meeting someone I knew who'd come over from the States, a young man named Ross Caputi, a native of Boston, or Boston as he calls it, whose family live in that city. And you would not know if you spoke to Ross that he was a US Marine. He was a combat infantryman in Iraq and in Fallujah, and he witnessed and to some extent took part in the sacking and irradiation of that city. And to his credit, he got into a lot of trouble on the ground because he was one of the only guys going, what are we doing here? And I think the killing happened about 2 o'clock, and I met him about 4. And as we sat and talked about this, our conclusion was clearly that they would try and de-link this from foreign policy, but that it could not be separated from foreign policy. And I kind of canvassed this with various other veterans from the UK and US, including 2 other guys, one of whom served in Iraq, and his job was to go to 4 houses a night in Baghdad, kick the doors in, blow the walls off, and take every military-age man. And another guy who, in terms of the sectarian stuff in Iraq, it's very interesting. As a matter of strategic policy, his job was to set up neighbourhood watches so that Sunnis would watch the Shias and create that. And of course, it comes back to this idea that the sectarian clash was waiting to happen. But these guys were there making it, and they're quite frank about it. And it's, for us at least, it's impossible. I mean, the only people who seem to be peddling this thing are the politicians. We know why they're doing it, because they have more wars planned, and a certain brand of liberal journalists who I'll come to shortly. But for us, you cannot separate what happened in Woolwich from foreign policy. And we have to be very clear, Woolwich, I'm not trying to talk it down, was brutal and unjustifiable and awful, but it is a fraction of what you see every day. A single afternoon in Baghdad or Kabul, you will see many, many of these, if you could walk around safely, which you probably could not. So we have to be very clear about that. And coming on to this de-linking process, and it's very interesting when you talk about the Enlightenment there, that a lot of the people doing this would hold themselves, I'm sure, as liberal-minded Enlightenment men, and of course I'm talking about the Cohens and the Friedlands of the world. And of course, to come to the conclusion that there's no connection, you would have to first of all ignore what the guy said, the guy with blood on his hands and a cleaver in his hands. He said that, and second of all, you would have to ignore everything else in the world, particularly at least the last 12 years of history, and going back much further, to try and disconnect the killing from what we do overseas. And I think it's a very dangerous thing in a number of ways to do that, because first of all, I think Terry Eagleton pointed out in a very good comment piece that when you try and portray these people as madmen, as they do, as just lone madmen, you diminish their responsibility to some extent. And of course, the second part of that is when you do that, it plays exactly into the hands, first of all, of imperialists who are pushing this agenda anyway, and as we saw, the far right, who lap this stuff up, because by delinking it, you make it, or tend to portray it as a kind of Muslim problem, that there's something about this racial, this racist idea that there's something wrong with Muslims, and they go around killing people, which of course we know is absolute rubbish. But so this is liberals kind of buttressing those arguments, and I think that's incredibly dangerous. The next thing, of course, is, I mean, considering these are liberal-minded people, it's interesting how they get so confused about these things. So we're talking about 2 very different concepts here. One of them is justification. Nothing can justify what they did to that lad, Lee Rigby, in Woolwich, but it can be explained. This is the other side. You can explain it, you can understand why it happened. I think we have a political and a moral duty to do that. I want to know why certain of my friends and colleagues died in Afghanistan. I want to know why people are dying on our streets here. You know, what happened to this idea of rational inquiry? That's the kind of thing which they peddle, and that we have to be very clear that it's right to ask why. And I think Rachel pointed out in one of her interviews that we need to have an iota of the courage that woman showed, who approached them and said, why are you doing this? Okay, we don't even need to be as brave as her because we're not confronted with a man with a gun and a cleaver. And then, I mean, the next thing is we're covering similar stuff here, but I think it needs to be said, is the tendency since this of sections of the media to legitimise people like Tommy Robinson. And we saw, if you want fascism to flourish, then cuddle it, give it a platform, treat it uncritically, and that certainly is what they're leading towards. I mean, he was, given a bye to say whatever he wanted and wasn't challenged in I can't remember the woman he was talking to, but there was a recent interview there. And we have to be clear that fascism is not a kind of shouty conservatism. It's not something which, if you give it a platform, it will discredit itself. These people are nasty, but they're not stupid, and so you have to harass them and chase them down and bully them and mock them and be active about this. Don't just put them on a stage and give them time to riff. So there's this no platform stuff is very, very important. And of course we have to look at the context of this. I mean, it's obviously not the 30s, but I mean there are kind of parallels. When you look, we have recession and crisis in this country, we have this background of war and imperialism, and that is fertile ground for these kinds of people. Okay, so we need to be very clear about posing them and not giving them space in which to flourish. That said, I think, despite, the EDL obviously very cynically used this. I think they called their protest at Downing Street, support our troops or something. They very cynically used this to try and push their agenda. And I think they failed. They were opposed and they were smashed, but of course they will come back. And I think it's interesting because I've also heard the arguments that if there wasn't surveillance, which is very topical at the moment, there would have been more attacks, and I think that's absolutely rubbish. I think written into the very DNA of Stop the War Coalition, and I came to it later, I understand there was an acknowledgement that wars like this would create extremism, so I think that's probably the reason that this kind of social consciousness about what it's really about that prevents more attacks like this. And yeah, that's what it comes back to, is that we've had less because Stop the War and the anti-war movement more broadly isn't just a forum in which to go and vent, but it's somewhere to act, which is obviously what these guys should have done. It's such a shame. I mean, really, both of these, the tragedy is that both of these groups, these two guys who went down their route, and this young man, Lee Rigby, would have been much better served being anti-war and being in the anti-war movement. It's a very good example of people of similar class backgrounds, I have no doubt, being thrown against each other for the interests of very, very few. And I have to say, just in closing, I grew up in the whitest of Whiteshire in Norfolk and North Yorkshire, and I've only been in London a year, but I think there's something, of course there's huge problems in London, there's probably something is a huge problem, but there's also, I really like, I'm quite taken with this, that I can walk down the street where I live and hear all these different languages and see all these different kinds of people. I'm not saying other kinds of people are kind of decorative, I'm saying it kind of makes my life richer for having them there, and that's something we really, really have to protect, and of course we have to do that together. And that's the key aim, because the fashion will come back, there are more wars on the horizon, and we have to really plan and organise to make sure these people don't get a foothold and these wars are brought to a close. Thank you.